My submission for the Builders Challenge Season 7, an end table with built-in wireless charging. I began the build with a rough cut, spalted poplar, and I start to break down that rough lumber into about the size I need it for the milling process. Now that we've gotten all of our components broken down into their rough sizes, we can begin the milling process to get square edges and flat faces. So here's a good example of the differences in the type of lumber we will be using to mill. These off the mill have a relatively square edge to work from, while these have a live edge that we will have to rip off with the bandsaw before taking it to the joiner. After getting the rough material into a workable state, begin to cut out the components. The first order of business is to glue up the panels because they will take some time to dry. Then I start to cut down the 8/4 pieces in the plans for the leg assemblies. When cutting a series of parts that all have to be the same length as the legs and the rails do in this piece, I like to gang cut them at the miter saw just to ensure that they are all exactly the same length. Then I begin the layout for the dados on my legs. Now this design has a pretty unique foot, which requires smaller pieces to be added to the exterior of the bottom of the legs . After the smaller pieces are laminated to the bottom of the legs, they are cut at an angle to give a really nice tapered look. Then I begin to cut the half laps and rabbets in the rail system that will fit around the panels that I glued up earlier. And after our panels have had time to dry, it's time to true up the edges and make sure that those panels are square so they fit properly into the design. Now it's time to cut the side panels to their final size. I was really excited with this project, and I finally got a project where I felt it would be cool to use epoxy. I didn't want to use the epoxy in the traditional quote-unquote river table sense, but I wanted to use it to accent the piece and give it a little flair. So one of my larger panels had a crack in it that needed to be stabilized, and I used that as my test run to try to get the color right for the epoxy that would eventually be poured on the top and the face of the drawer. I finally got the pigment mixture correct on the second time around, and this more deep white is what I finally ended up going with. Then I just had to clean up the bits of the plywood that were stuck to the piece and flatten out the epoxy that was over poured to get it flush. So one of the perfect uses for the micro zip is cleaning up these little bites left by a dado stack and a half-lap joint. Even the best dado blades I've found always leave a little bit of variation because the chippers don't catch everything, and it cleans it up really fast. And then it was time to start gluing the rails to the panels. Before I got too deep into the assembly, I wanted to do a mock-up for the wireless charger and make sure that I removed enough material from that panel so that the phone could charge effectively through the wood. So you remember those dados that I cut into the legs earlier? They will correspond with a notch cut away from the edge of the panel that will make the structure all fit together, nice and snug. Now it's time to start applying glue and to put together the main carcass of the cabinet. The rabbets and the rails on the edge of the panel will correspond with the tops of the legs and make it sit securely on the top. I made this quick little jig that corresponds with the edge of the drawer so I could drill the holes out and pin the drawer together with dowels. Then the tabletop will be pinned down to the legs with a much larger dowel on the end. I wanted a really natural look to the epoxy inlay in the top and front of this table, so I actually used the live edge board I had laying around the shop and used that as my template, then routed that waste material away that would later be filled with epoxy. So I reached out to Andrew Jews Woodworks on Instagram, and asked him what epoxy he recommended I use as a beginner. He suggested this Total Boat, and it really worked great, and by this point I had the color just where I wanted. I set up my forms to pour the top first, then I moved on to the drawer face, and later, once that epoxy dried, I laid the cabinet on its back and then poured the small little void that was left where the bottom rail intersects with the drawer. Now it's just time for the finish. This Maker Brand Co. Simple Finish has been my go-to finish lately. Then to mount the wireless charger, I just used a bit of hot glue, mounted the charger, put a couple of dabs of hot glue in the channel for the cord, and pulled the cord tight to seat it into place. I really enjoy how this build turned out. It's spalted poplar with an epoxy accent, and for a first timer, I don't think I did too bad. Thanks so much for watching, y'all. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and always remember to get better every day.